right. So, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'd like to welcome you to our Ask Me Anything event with our guest speaker, David Levine. My name is Nina Taylor, and I serve as the Chief Executive Officer for the Center for Election Science. And before we get into our chat, I wanted to review a few housekeeping rules. We are streaming live within our educational platform, as well as YouTube, LinkedIn, and X. So no matter where you are watching from, we welcome you to our event. Today's event will kick off with introductions and move into an informal chat. We will collect your questions along the way, so feel free to use the chat to ask questions of our guests, and you'll see your questions woven into the discussion. We expect to see very many questions for the presentation, and we will make every effort to get to as many as possible. Whether this is your first time joining us or you are a longtime supporter of our work, we ask that you remain respectful on all platforms. While we have our differences in opinion, we would like to ensure that our educational environments in all engagements remain professional, open, and respectful of all participants. Any non-compliance of our code of conduct, you will find yourself removed from the event. In this critical time in the reform community, I would like to ask you to continue to support our work. You can make a donation to the Center for Election Science on our website, electionscience.org/giving, and we encourage you to become a monthly donor. Thank you to everyone who supports our work in kind, in donation, and in sharing our mission with your network. All right. So let's get into our conversation. I'm so excited to have David join us. David Levine is an election integrity and management consultant who works to ensure that eligible voters can vote. Free and fair elections are perceived as legitimate, and election processes are properly administered and secured. He is also an election security adjunct professor at George Mason University, an advisory committee member for the Global Cyber Alliance Cybersecurity Toolkit for Elections, an advisory council member for the Election Reformers Network, a member of the Election Verification Network, and a contributor to the Fulcrum. When are you not busy? Previously, he worked as the Senior Elections Integrity Fellow at the German Marshall Fund Alliance for Security and Democracy, where he assessed vulnerabilities in electoral infrastructure, administration, and policies. And before that, he was the Ada County, Idaho Election Director, managing the administration of all federal, state, county, and local district elections for 25% of the state's population. Welcome to the CES Multiverse, David.
Nina, thanks so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
Awesome. So let's get into it. Can you start out by sharing how you got into this work and what motivates you to stay?
Sure, Nina. No, first off, let me thank both you for moderating this conversation, the Center for Election Science for having me here, and the opportunity to talk about, I think, some really timely and important issues, not only on election security, but obviously issues that are near and dear to your organization as well. Just to sort of step back, I think I would say that I first got my feet wet in this field actually as far back as 2006. I'm not sure how many folks that are on this call have done grad school or perhaps even done law school, but I was a first-year law student, and I had a unpaid sort of clerkship lined up for the summer, which was great. But like many other grad and law students are trying to do, you're trying to make a little bit of money, right? Some pocket change to perhaps get you through the year or perhaps pay off loans. And there was an election in Cuyahoga County, Cleveland, where I was in law school that didn't go according to plan. And there were a whole host of issues. And the Cuyahoga County Board of Elections smartly put together a 3-member panel to look at what went wrong. Huge expertise. The part that wasn't as smart was that those 3 members decided that their grunts, their lackeys, would be law students from the local law schools, of which I was one of them. And so I was grunt number 5 or 6, I can't remember, but I, through that experience, not only made copies and got coffee and plugged in telephones, but I also had a chance to look at issues that existed in Cuyahoga County's Board of Elections. This was an election where it was the last election that they had in which they had to roll out new voting equipment in order to get federal Help America Vote Act funding, and they weren't ready to do that, and that caused issues. There were concerns around and issues with poll worker training. There were even issues around who procured certain kinds of equipment for elections. And in some cases, the county was soliciting and getting bids for equipment that had to be sole sourced and vice versa. Some people really didn't like that experience. I loved it. And that was what subsequently led to internships with the Election Assistance Commission in its infancy, and then work for advocacy organizations, for example, like Common Cause, and then later work with election administration bodies. And I've been pursuing that work ever since. And, in terms of sort of the desire and the need to be in this space, I mean, I think obviously, I think probably the 2024 election is the latest election to sort of speak for itself there. I think, at a time when, there are a lot of people questioning, both for some legitimate reasons and less legitimate, right? The sort of the trust in American democracy and elections. It's really important that we have people that are engaged in this fight to ensure, right, that people's voices are heard when they go to cast a vote. And so, that moment has arguably sort of never been more important than now. And even when I feel frustrated by what might be going on, I think that continues to fuel me.
Thank you for sharing that. And I think that's a perfect segue because we're officially kind of in the autopsy of what happened in 2024's general election era. And so, from your perspective, highs and lows of the 2024 general election, what worked well? And what areas do we need additional improvements to safeguard our elections?
Yeah, I think that's a good place to start, Nina. And, I didn't get to mention this, but until recently, I was helping the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, a 60-member sort of transatlantic organization of which the U.S. is a member, right, observe elections. This is an international entity that invited the U.S. to observe. And I helped the mission, right, assess the U.S. election. And we recently, it was on November 6th, the day after the election, came out with a statement of preliminary findings and conclusions. And in terms of some high points, right, I think you'd be hard pressed to find folks who didn't think that the election was administered pretty well, particularly considering the climate that folks were in. I think, again, irrespective of whatever you thought of the result of the election, which is a whole separate thing, right? I think this election demonstrated the resilience in a number of respects of the country's democratic institutions. I think that's really noteworthy, right? The fact that we had enough people who were willing to serve as poll workers in spite of threats that we've seen going back as far as 2020. The fact that election officials seemed to be prepared for lots of contingencies. And when things went wrong, right, when there were false bomb threats allegedly coming from foreign adversaries or others, right, there seemed to be contingencies in place that enabled folks to continue to be able to vote, right? In some cases, there was extensions of the polling day. And we saw election officials in a number of cases go to even greater lengths to try and be transparent about the process so that folks would have a better understanding, right? In a swing state like Arizona, you saw a situation where people, frankly, could view tabulation, right, of vote either in a remote or in-person capacity. And then, again, it wasn't the same as in 2020, so we could talk about it more. But our judiciary generally seemed to hold up. There were a couple of decisions that I think, at least I would have taken issue with, but I think by and large, there was a whole lot of pre-election litigation, a lot of which was pretty flimsy, and a lot of that got turned aside, which I think speaks to the fact that we continue to have, I think, you may not agree with every decision that comes from the judiciary, but I think it continues to sort of do its job, at least in terms of defending elections. And then, I think one other thing that's worth touching on, right, that I think it was important, was that it looks like we're going to have voter turnout that approaches, right, what we had in 2020. And I think that's noteworthy. When in 2020, we had the highest turnout we had in over a century. And, you're talking about, considering that was, of course, considering the pandemic. And of course, at that point, we're talking about women getting the right to vote, right? So, I think that piece is those are some positives. I think on the places where it didn't go as well, I think there are some things that I think are worth touching on. I mean, I think a top line thing is that we continue to see ongoing spurious, unfounded claims about election fraud, disinformation campaigns, threats, political violence, right? And again, I don't want to say that it was political violence was occurring all the time, but we heard, there were a couple of threats. against the president-elect. And there were, threats and political violence, right, toward sort of other folks as well. There were, again, continued to be concerns about foreign interference, including through cyber attacks. And, of course, repeated claims, right, by President-elect Trump of widespread electoral fraud. And leading up to the election, then, of course, a continuation of those claims from 2020. And so, it appears, I always want to be careful. It's great that since election day, things have been relatively quiet, but, I think I would be lying, right? If and being a little either disingenuous or naive, if we didn't think that a certain amount of that quietness was associated with the outcome and the manner in which that election was won. Right. And so I think, there isn't anything to indicate that we're going to have more than perhaps a pause, right, in this sort of, fight for U.S. democracy. So again, lots of disinformation, instances of violence, harsh and intolerant language, right? Our report talked about being directed at women and immigrants, right? Particularly, obviously, by one candidate. There was also record high spending in the elections, right? That I think, we talked about in our statement, right? Raising concerns about financial contributions, unregulated ones, disproportionate advantages with candidates with extensive funding. And of course, again, that hostile rhetoric wasn't just towards some of the groups I mentioned. We talk about that toward journalists. And of course, in an increasingly fractured media environment, what that might mean, right, for where people are getting their information. And so, that those were some issues. And the only other thing that the OSCE paid some attention to, right, as well, that's perhaps worth noting, is that there are certain segments of the U.S. citizenry that continue to remain, right, disenfranchised. And I know that may be viewed by some as a political football, but I hope we can get to a place where it's not. And for those that may be not familiar, we're talking about, again, felons who have served their sentences, people with intellectual disabilities and guardianship agreements, and of course, residents in places like Washington, D.C. and in U.S. territories, right, where there's, limited forms of representation. So there's a bit of what worked and went pretty well in some places where there could be some improvement. And I know that that's not exhaustive, but hopefully illustrative.
Thank you for sharing that. And I, being a native of Washington, D.C., and, our constant push for statehood, I love that you included that talking point. So you mentioned 2020, and, we have found that there had been interference in the election. So, what lessons had been learned in the aftermath of the 2020 election, and particularly in terms of handling contested results, right? Have we learned our lessons? To be able to look at 2024 and beyond, and for, I think, regular everyday voters feel like the election is safe and secure.
I think it's a good question. I mean, I think this is sort of a mixed bag. I mean, I think on some level, I think there was learning that happened, right? Nobody came into this cycle, right, naive or unaware of the potential threat environment that existed. And I think you would hear that from Democrats, and you'd hear that from Republicans, like the Kentucky Secretary of State. And so we saw, right, measures, I think it's really important. We did see measures to strengthen in some places the safety of election workers and the infrastructure, right? We saw post-election developments, in some cases to ensure that the integrity of vote counting, right, wasn't threatened. So we saw stronger sort of chain of custody protocols. We saw a situation where in some places we saw more opportunities provided to be able to vote. And again, I want to be clear, there were places where there was rollbacks, but there were places where we saw expansions. And we're now at a place where we have 47 states that have early voting in some form, 36 that have no excuse absentee voting. And of course, the other 14 have certain reasons why somebody might be able to request an absentee ballot. We saw more adoption of paper ballots. So, I think we saw election officials that continued to sort of do some good work. And I think that we saw some additional efforts made to better support, right, those officials. I think about CISA, right, getting regional election supervisors to provide more support, particularly to jurisdictions that have less security expertise. I think about the Foreign Malign Influence Center within the Department of National Intelligence that was basically stood up in 2022 that I think was in a much more aggressive way calling out efforts by foreign actors like Russia and Iran to try and interfere in the election. This was not a rerun of 2016 where there was sort of reluctance to call out actors because perhaps there was going to be concerns of political bias. We saw law enforcement intelligence making those kinds of calls. And of course, we saw voters answer the call to be able to, it appears, to vote. We saw voters answer the call to be able to vote and then continue to participate as poll workers. I should also say that we had better, in some respects, coverage by media, right? There was, I think, in some instances, for example, as opposed to what happened in 2016, where information might have been laundered by foreign entities and media sort of unwittingly sort of just put it out. There was instances where that kind of behavior tried to sort of repeat itself in this election cycle, and mainstream media in particular did a solid job of not giving that more fodder than or giving that more attention than it deserved. So I think those were some places where clearly there were, I think, lessons learned. But there are places where there remains concerns. And you don't have to go far to think about it. If we know that there were folks who wanted to succeed where they had failed after trying to overturn the 2020 election. And some of those folks, like a Rudy Giuliani, have faced accountability for their actions. And some of those folks have not. And I think this is going to become a real test, right? I think for those of us in the democratic space, as we think about, particularly the next 4 years, about how we make sure the guardrails of democracy hold up, how we make sure that we are planning accordingly, and that we are making sure that our elections, which, while imperfect, have continued to ensure that the voice of the American people, is reflected, continues to do that moving forward.
Yeah, thank you for that. So earlier in the fall, we connected while talking about AI's potential influence in the 2024 general election and bad actors that are getting really crafty. One of the recommendations to counter the spread of disinformation is adopting kind of whole society frameworks to build resilience, especially in communities that are most vulnerable, those that you had outlined. What resources do we need to counter foreign influence operations, and how should we effectively communicate to the American public that foreign interference in our elections is absolutely possible and happens worldwide? And if you can kind of open it up for our folks on what we were looking at in terms of AI, like what the possibilities could have been for an attack, I'd love to share that with our folks.
Sure, absolutely. And so, I think AI, which is of course artificial intelligence, has really, has given the ability for sophisticated, deep pocket actors, both foreign and domestic, to be able to either introduce narratives, that are false in nature to try and change the minds, of folks in democratic societies. But it also has the ability to, frankly, make it easier for folks to be able to interfere in elections and be able to conduct, for example, cyber attacks, on pieces of the electoral infrastructure, like being able to breach a voter registration system or be able to conduct a denial of service attack, on an election management and reporting system, where one might go, for example, maybe to sort of find the results of a given election, unofficial results. And so, what we've seen is that, we've seen mainly sort of generative AI tools become sort of more popular since the 2022 midterm elections. And what we've seen sort of as a result of that in countries across the world is we are seeing adversaries like Russia, China, and Iran using, these tools to create fake newscasts to distribute information, create fake criminal incidents to perhaps stick to to connect with a particular candidate in hopes, of getting folks to perhaps support another candidate who might be able to sort of further their agenda. And I think, we're at a real inflection point. I know that feels overused, but, in that sort of fight for democracy versus autocracy, particularly at a time when we're seeing so many challenges that democracies are suffering, whether it's the results of fair elections like in the United States, or it's implosions of governments that are usually sort of pretty calm in some respects, like what we saw recently in Germany. So, I think what generative AI and artificial intelligence has allowed is for more people to be able to have access to tools and technologies in which they can create, right, in many cases, right, more information to be able to sort of share with others. And in the hands of folks who do good, I think that can be really helpful. In the case of nefarious actors, that can obviously sort of be harmful. Happy to sort of follow up on different pieces of that, but that's sort of I think where we're at. And I think that this is something that really law enforcement and intelligence was focused a lot, right, in the 2024 election cycle, which was not only a big election year for U.S. elections, but globally, right? This was the biggest election year on record. And what's interesting, though we still have some time to look at this, is that in many ways it doesn't necessarily appear as if artificial intelligence played a huge role in how elections were ultimately both carried out, right, and then in the result. But I think we are clearly seeing it deployed more and more in the information space, and we do expect, we get more as necessary, that it will get deployed more in the election administration space as we go forward, for fiscal, technological, and security related reasons.
Thank you for that. We're going to go ahead and wave in some comments from the chat. And so William wants to know, is there any evidence of unjust election machine problems this time around?
Any evidence of unjust? Well, I would want to get a little clarification from William, if he's willing, on what unjust might mean. But if I say unjust, right, so the way I might answer that is there were some isolated instances where machines stopped working, but that by and large, in those instances, they were not nefarious, they were not done purposefully, and I'm not aware of any evidence to suggest in those cases that due diligence wasn't done to try and ensure that those machines were going to work properly on election day, right? But there are a number of jurisdictions that have older technology. And so one of the things that can sometimes happen is that these machines may not work. And so in most jurisdictions, many, right, if your machines stop working, there are contingencies that are often in place so that people can continue to vote. So for example, in many jurisdictions, right, in some where there were issues where machines went down, other scanners were used, or in those machines that stopped working, people had the option of being able to fill out their paper ballot and put it into a secure bin, and have that bin be subsequently transported where those ballots could be tabulated. Right now, if voters for some reason didn't want to feel comfortable with that, they might be able, depending on where they were, to either come back and vote later at that location, or in some places they could go to another location and vote. So I don't believe there was any, certainly not significant evidence of unjust machine problems. What I'm aware of are isolated instances in which machines stop working. And, unfortunately, that sometimes happens from time to time. But that's part of the reason, again, why it's so great that generally election officials and jurisdictions are most, not all, but in many cases, expanding opportunities to vote. Right? If you go and vote ahead of time and you happen to bump into that, then you've got more options, of course.
Awesome. William has also included some clarifications, or just kind of expanding. So uneven distribution, big populations, fewer machines, and are machines certified in advance of the election?
Got it. Okay. Well, that's helpful to have from William. And William, I appreciate that. So we've begun to see, right? Well, I think there's always questions about this. In 2014, there was a bipartisan report put out by the Presidential Commission on Election Administration. And I think one of the things that was really helpful about that, for example, was that there began to be more of an emphasis on using basically tool calculators, right? And using math, right, to be able to do things like resource allocation, identifying line lengths, mitigating those kinds of challenges, right? And so we've now begun to see more efforts. It's not perfect, but in that regard, right, we're seeing more jurisdictions using calculators to assess how many workers they need and how many machines they need so that they can have people vote within 30 minutes, right? We're seeing more jurisdictions that are adopting electronic poll books. Those are sort of the laptops that check in voters so that if you come into a polling place, you're less likely, for example, to go in one line wait for a while, go up to, and then be told you should have been in the other line, right? That is a rarity now. And usually if you aren't at the right polling place, through that laptop, workers are able to see where you might be able to go, or maybe able to explain to you for some reason why you may not be able to be regularly checked in. So I think there are efforts being made there. Obviously, there are places where this kind of thing still continues to be a bit of an issue, but most of the places where I'm aware of where that has occurred is usually because of unforeseen circumstances or just situationally, right? If there's a long line at the beginning of the day, hard to sort of do much with that. If there is a natural weather disaster, right, or inclement weather, that obviously changes things. So I think about places in North Carolina that were impacted by Hurricane Helene. Again, there were rules that were made to provide voters more opportunities, but between making people aware of those changes and then making sure people could get to those locations, I understand in some cases it took a little while longer to be able to cast some ballots, to allocate those resources. Nothing that I was aware of that was either intentional or beyond the pale there, though.
Awesome. And then, and thank you, William, for your question. So Joel wants to know your thoughts on mail-in ballots and campaign reform.
Sure. So, I think it's really important that mail-in ballots, I think, play a critical part, right, in U.S. elections. And while the process is not foolproof by any sense, people should have confidence, right, in mail-in ballot voting. That doesn't mean there haven't been issues, again, about, how quickly, and you've probably seen some reporting about how quickly the USPS could be able to process mail ballots and questions about were people adequately staffed and resourced. But I think, for example, when we had the 2020 election, hopefully I'm not getting ahead of myself here, but when we had the pandemic, in response to delays in mail, which not affected just the U.S. but other countries, you saw more jurisdictions enact drop boxes, which were really important because suddenly voters could fill out their ballot, and after they received it in the mail, they could put it in a drop box, which was made for election officials who could then pick it up, and that could help mitigate the issue. But no, mail-in voting is a really important tool for voting. It came about, frankly, in the Civil War to help make sure that soldiers could vote. And over time, it's become an increasingly, I think, important part of U.S. elections. Now, it may be used a little less in this presidential election than during the pandemic, right, for public health reasons. But it is a reliable process, and a process that is being increasingly refined and secured, right? We have more and more states that now enable you to track your ballot from when it's sent to you to when you receive it to when you send it back and it gets counted. We have more and more states that now engage in what's called ballot curing, right? And that was a real issue, because before you might get your mail ballot and send it in, and if you filled it out wrong, right, if you do that in person, somebody could tell you can get it fixed. Mail-in balloting, that used to be sort of an issue, but now we have jurisdictions, right, where there is more and more jurisdictions where you have the ability to get that fixed and still have your vote be counted. So that is a positive, attribute as well. Doesn't mean, again, that there aren't challenges to be worked out, but this is a secure, reliable form of voting, and one that I think voters should consider and feel free to take advantage of if they think that's the best way for them to be able to vote. The other question was about campaign reform. And just as a clarification, what part of campaign reform, and that can go a few different ways, is the question with regards to?
Yeah.
Only because I don't want to answer something that wasn't what Joel was intending.
Yeah. So Joel has a couple of. Joel, please put any clarification in terms of what you really want to chat about when it comes to the campaign question. But we have another question from Joel. Have you experienced complexity issues between methods like ranked choice voting versus approval voting, example, computational intensity or runoffs?
Yeah, no, I certainly, in my experience, and I know Nia touched on this at the outset, right? I've been an election administrator, and so I've had a chance to administer elections not only in Idaho, but also in Washington, D.C. and Virginia. And I've also actually even had a chance to administer elections with a private vendor. And through that vendor, I actually got to one time sort of be part of RCV voting, or help administer it in sort of Portland, Maine. So even a little bit of it on the administrative side. I think, for me, when we talk the complexity stuff, I think will not come as a surprise to folks here. I think Part of this is familiarity, right? We know that approval voting, it's, as you guys know here, there are just a couple of jurisdictions that do this, and there's a question about, people being familiar with it, right? I think ranked choice voting is something that, in some respects, has perhaps gotten greater attention, in some cases popularity, but it's something that Nina touched on, I think, at the top. It had some successes, DC, and it might stave off failure in Alaska, I think, last I saw, but there were some places where it didn't succeed. And so, I think, I've sort of seen that play out. I know that, when we think about ranked choice voting, I think there's been, I'm not, while I think there are aspects of it that I think are redeemable, I do think that there's, I think, a fair case to be made that for any of these methods, there's not necessarily a one-size-fits-all approach, right? And I think there has been some research that has raised questions about, understanding how ranked choice voting works, and whether or not people understand how it works, whether that affects how they turn out. And by the way, how does ranked choice voting, what does that mean, right, for certain kinds of races?
Right.
When we think about, how to make, there's certain kinds of races where, it could be very helpful, for example, in ensuring that maybe the intent and the spirit of the Voting Rights Act is being fulfilled, and other kinds of races where it may not, right? And so, I've certainly experienced the complexity issues sort of from a policy standpoint, as well as from the administrative side. I mean, the runoff thing, I think, is a fascinating one, because, of course, there are these questions about, how dog tired the election staff is and their ability to do an election, the folks in terms of being able to vote, how you accommodate all your voters, right? So depending on how quickly you have that runoff, what that means for servicing overseas and military voters, and just from a, frankly, a budgetary standpoint,
Yeah.
how you plan and engage in that kind of behavior as well. So hopefully that begins to answer, right, some of the complexity pieces, but happy to sort of touch a bit more on some of that stuff if folks have more questions.
Awesome. And thank you, Joel, for your question. Just as a reminder for folks that are online, please drop your questions into the chat, and we'll, of course, get them woven into the discussion. I think my next question, I'm actually going to pose to the chat. I think, please use the chat for this response. But as you know, I think our community, we've been tracking 11 electoral system-specific ballot measures. So ranked choice voting was preemptively banned in Missouri, rejected by voters in Nevada, Oregon, Idaho, and Colorado, passed in DC with open primaries. And votes are still being counted in Alaska to repeal, but it would be split, right? There would be like this kind of large segment for, and again, it's like right in the middle.
Yeah.
And really millions were spent on these efforts.
Yeah.
So chat, what do you believe this might signal from the American voter? And I would love to kind of weave some of that into our discussion as well. So with the repeals and all these ballot measures now, what do you think that might signal for the American voter and what they feel about alternative voting methods? And so as the chat works on their questions related to that, I've got another one here from Donna Space. And so with the burning of absentee ballot boxes in Arizona, how are those votes and slash voters captured, their preferences captured?
Donna, I appreciate your question. I'm going to be honest and tell you that I don't have enough familiarity, the details there, to be able to know how that was done. I am aware that something similar took place in Oregon and Washington in the election cycle. And in that case, there was an effort to basically go through and assess both which ballots, right, could still be readable, and then, which was the case, and then an effort, right, which in that case was to sort of try and, not only, as I understand it, count those ballots, but to inform those voters that those ballots had been received. But there was also, as I understand it, in many cases, a communique put out about this, right, that invited voters to be able to reach out if they had questions about whether this impacted their ballot. And as I understand it, a back-end process by election officials to sort of compare at a later date, right, who had requested a ballot, where a ballot had been, who had received a ballot at a certain point, with a reminder to folks that included something about the possibility that maybe their ballot had not been included there, and to let them know that there could be, right, arrangements and contingencies so that hopefully that person's vote could ultimately be counted. So that hopefully answers in sort of broad brushstrokes there. Nina, I'm also feel free if I want, I mean, to dive in at the risk of, on your question to the chat, but I don't want to get ahead of that one either.
Yeah, no, I would love to hear your hot take on that. I mean, we, I've got Jack. That says RCV failed due to misinformation presented by the establishment as convoluted and subverting the will of the majority, i.e., Alaska being a red state, end up with a Democrat. And that comes from, I guess, Senator Cotton. What's your take? And possibly I'll also share what I
Please, and I also welcome, it goes without saying, pushback or correction or differing opinions on this thing, as you noted at the point at the top, Nina. No, I think that's a really important point to flag. I mean, I do think some of this is I think there have been efforts, right, by some folks to make this out to be a political issue when it's not, and the fact that that the Alaska Congresswoman, right, won in the prior election and with RCV and now is losing here, right? I mean, what would hopefully, among other things, I think raise some questions sort of about that. I do think, there's a sense that because this perhaps had gotten some steam in some left-leaning places, and because of the comments of some folks like Senator Cotton that I think were divorced from reality. I think that's a piece of it. And I think that's important. I do think, though, that there are some others where, there have been folks that I think have spoken out on the issue a little bit, right? I think of Secretary of State Aguilar in Nevada, right, who have sort of talked about, there are issues, that we think are more important to sort of first be dealing with and making sure that we've got our ducks in a row on with regards to elections before we make the jump and go to RCV, right? And I think I think that's an important piece. And again, I think the other thing, beyond political, beyond sort of the administrative, is people's is being able to sort of carry out the election and to do it in a way that I think, again, sort of folks, right, understand, right, and are participating in. And again, I think there's been some research that seems to suggest that, again, RCV, like in some cases approval voting, can help moderate extremes, but there's a question about whether or not in some cases people are able to fully understand, right, how to sort of fill out the an RCV ballot. That, if I'm being honest, for me is not an issue, but that's not the yardstick that I use to measure whether or not that means it's good for elections, because if that were the case, then there could be it's not a big issue for me to use voter ID either, but that doesn't mean, again, that I support proof of citizenship or stringent forms of voter ID before somebody casts a ballot. So
yeah, and I think that's spot on. I love that we had so many ballot measures put in front of the American people. I think that was fantastic. I do believe that even before we started to get some traction with approval voting, it was almost kind of like RCV, one size fits all, is going to replace plurality all across this country. And I don't think that is true. I'm a native Washingtonian, so here in DC, when I went to go vote, the person next to me saw the ballot language and he said out loud, "I have no idea what this means," right? And so I am concerned around not only how these changes are educated, but especially in communities that they might not have the same level of access. If we look at New York and even this race in San Francisco that uses RCV, I just don't think that when you have a kind of a divide inside of a particular city when it comes to race, ethnicity, the number of people that's kind of running now, right? Like, who are you going to rank sixth? It is something that I think we need to start to kind of think about. But I like that we're in a democracy test kitchen era. I think that we should be using different types of reforms, and it really should be community specific and led. And I also believe that as a reform, we shouldn't overpromise anything related to what our reforms can and cannot do. And so, again, education is key. But I do think that there needs to be, I think, more, I would say, smothered and covered opportunities for different reforms to get enacted across this country. So I love that you guys are active in the chat. We're going to go ahead and put one up from SAS. An argument one of my volunteers makes is that having highly polarized politics and a plethora of high profile races with narrow win margins every cycle causes distrust in election outcomes. As reformers, we believe that better voting methods like approval voting can bring down the temperature, elect candidates fewer voters strongly dislike, and give stronger mandates to lead. What are your thoughts on how better voting methods can indirectly affect public trust in elections? Thanks for the question, Sass.
Sure, Sass. No, I appreciate that question. I mean, I think that, so I'll first, and it's good that it's up on the screen because I can then refer back, but I think that highly polarized politics and plethora of high profile races with narrow win margins, I think I'm not quite sure that it causes distrust. I mean, I think it can cause distrust in election outcomes. I also think it's sort of, reality. I mean, I think we need to, if we could have robust debate, right, but share the same facts, right? If we could have, and I mean, I think have done that before, and we had high profile races where margins were close. That would mean a divided country, but at least we'd have a shared reality. And I think that wouldn't necessarily cause distrust in election outcomes. That would indicate that, candidates have to sort of campaign and they've got to figure out, right, how to win. But I do take the broader point here, and I take your point too about, one of the issues with plurality voting, which is sort of what it's, as the most common method that's used, is that if your guy wins with 35% of the vote, right, that meant 65% didn't support. And I think that that's certainly, I think, a fair point. And I think that, again, other methods, approval voting, depending on where it's done, ranked choice voting, can have the ability of getting people, right, bringing down that temperature, electing people, I think, that aren't necessarily on the extremes. And we've seen that play out. And again, I would welcome the feedback and the pushback. And again, I'd be interested to hear the examples in the approval voting side. But I think even notwithstanding whatever I think of the current New York City mayor, obviously that was somebody that was not necessarily further, left in the New York City primary. And I know that Virginia's governor, of course, right, was elected and was not the furthest right candidate in the Virginia Republican Party. That's not to say that either one of those were perfect. But I think that I do believe, right, that there's a possibility there. I think there's also some things like proportional representation, right, and other kinds of things that can help ensure that, right, that I think people's true choices are reflected in the outcome. I mean, I think it is worth noting that the president-elect will win the popular vote and in a legitimate election, but will do so in spite of the fact, right, certainly a legitimate election, but that with pretty high, right, disapproval ratings, and that his opponent, Vice President Harris, also had fairly high, right, disapproval ratings. And I think it's also worth noting that there's obviously a large portion of the country that either on certain issues or maybe even more generally doesn't necessarily see themselves as Republican or Democrat. And we saw candidates come into the race that tried to sort of perhaps steal some of that thunder. I think of RFK or others, and Jill Stein and others, but didn't necessarily, there was not a sense, I think, for most folks that there was anything other than perhaps a spoiler role for those. And so I think that I think to your point, I do think there are voting methods that could perhaps bring down the temperature in the right, I think, situations, and perhaps might give stronger mandates to lead, which I think could be helpful on the public trust question. I will caveat the last part by saying that, I do get concerned, right, that, we've seen particularly since sort of 2016 or 2020, that anytime we see a certain voting method, a candidate that seems to sort of represent a threat to those that can't tell the difference between a free and fair election and a rigged one, right, that's the next thing that gets, that's the next thing that becomes on the chopping block, right? Whether we're talking about sort of, in some respects, ranked choice voting, or whether we're talking about, trying to undermine the Supreme Court or the Senate consent and approval process, or attacking election officials. And so, I do think that I am hopeful that better voting methods like those I think could be helpful. But I do want to warn folks that I think there's a cost. Unfortunately, in the current environment we live, there's a cost to success that we've seen, particularly if it's at odds with those who've tried to previously subvert American democracy.
Awesome. And we're going to probably get some shirts made at this point that says cost for success. So we're paying the big costs. All right. So many states now have post-election audits. How effective are these audits in detecting discrepancies or fraud? And should they be widely implemented across all states?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And something that was I would add, before the sort of election denier subversion movement, I think this was something that was appropriately very much front and center. And I think, so what I would say is that more jurisdictions are adopting post-election audits. And at the very least, what that's doing is helping ensure that the voting equipment in many cases is working properly. And in an increasing number of jurisdictions, it's helping validate the outcomes of races. But there's still room for improvement. And I say that on the other side, right? I want to be clear. The 2024 election was carried out in a manner that reflected the will of the American people, and there's no reason to question that outcome. But there are only a few places that have statistically significant post-election audits, right? Ones that can mathematically ensure, right, the who's the winner and who's the loser, and they're not necessarily done in all the races. So the more that we can move in that direction, which again would run, the National Academy of Sciences did a report in 2018 talking about the hope that post-election audits could be, risk-limiting post-election audits could be adopted nationwide by 2028, within a decade. Unfortunately, I don't think we're on a path or a glide path to hit that mark, but we ought to be looking to get in that direction, right? Moving toward something like what Colorado is doing, right? Virginia is going to be doing a post-election audit, and some, statistically significant ones later this week. We need more of that happening, because it not only can statistically validate the outcome, it can also help ensure that we're identifying any issues that might arise, either nefarious or accidental, right? And so again, steps are being taken in the right direction. We can go more into this, but there remains some room for improvement. And I'm hopeful, now that we're largely on the other side, that we can continue to surge in the right direction in those places where either there aren't mandatory post-election audits, or in places where we have them, but we could have them, be more robust.
I love that. All right, so we're going to take another question. William, you're going to get the gold star for for your questions. If gerrymandering was outlawed, do you think politics, the two sides will move closer to the middle, and meaning less polarization?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think what I would say is, I think if gerrymandering was outlawed, right, if the U.S. was in compliance with the Venice Commission, right, and we had districts that were drawn in sort of a compact manner, right, not like a salamander, right, but drawn in a compact manner that I think, weren't dictated largely by politics, right, which is the case in many places. Right. There are some states, to be fair, that have exceptions, that have nonpartisan commissions that are doing a better job of this, but in many places it's politically dictated. I think we could see elections that were even more reflective, right, of the will of the people. Right. It's worth noting that the Senate as an institution, of course, benefits more so. There's greater representation. Right. There's more power for the voters of Wyoming than there is in California. And I don't mean that. I mean, we could find a small blue state and do Texas, right? We could do it both ways. But the House's idea was to sort of, was to be that sort of check. And if your districts aren't drawn, right, as compactly, or they're drawn in sort of these, strange sort of ways, then that begins to undermine that piece. And of course, that's part of the reason, among others, why we've seen a call to increase in some quarters the number of people serving the House of Representatives. So again, for example, a place like California might even have more members in the House. So I think if it was outlawed, I think it would be more reflective of the will of the people. And I think it would mean people would have to fight for more votes, and we would have fewer incumbents that could coast to victory. That's not the same thing as moving to the middle, right? I'm always, it's not that, somebody who has worked for folks of both political parties. I mean, I have friends on both sides that believe they're good folks on both sides, but, the question is, what does the middle mean? Right. And, if, I don't know what to tell you but if the middle means, to take a bad example, right, mass deportations on one side, and, we're going to prosecute everybody, but we're not going to allow asylum seekers in on the other. The middle, that middle is a different middle than the immigration debate 10 years earlier. Right. The middle on voter ID, right, has changed in a way that it used to be, where you now have a situation where more Democrats are sort of open to that, right? So it has moved. So, I'd be mindful about what that means. And I would be mindful too about, when we have facts versus fiction, what the middle looks like there, right? What I do think it might mean on some level is there, in an ideal world, right? It would, I think perhaps get people to, in some cases, try and work with one another, right? Or folks in other political parties, because if you have gerrymandering and you think your pressure is coming from within your own party, right, then you feel like what you need to do is kowtow to your base on some level, win the primary, and you're home free. And so in that way, right, I think there's merit to what you're saying, but that to me isn't quite the same thing, because, that's not necessarily moving to the middle. That's just being, sometimes sometimes cross-partisan. And so I just want to, offer a little clarification on that, on the second part of your question, if that made sense.
That's awesome. So, I would be remiss in not having a moment to talk about social media's role in elections, right? And so I know now there are task forces that are created to combat some of the disinformation, some guardrails in place. From your expert opinion, have they gone far enough, or is there more to be done to protect, essentially a healthy democracy when it comes to social media?
No, I think that, I want to be clear in saying I don't think social media, right, caused, I think sometimes people think caused the problem. I don't think that it caused the problem, but I think, unfortunately it's found itself, right, an amplifier of it. And of course, while there were steps that certain social media companies took, for example, in the run up to the 2020 election, I think to, perhaps, right, work with the federal government, for example, and to help, combat, right, false information about elections, we've seen, right, rolling back in a number of respects. I don't, it's not that I obviously want to be apolitical, but, if I avoid sort of calling out certain things, then, I just risk either sounding naive or being, right, acting, right, not informed. So, look, obviously the purchase of X by Elon Musk has drastically changed, right, how X goes about dealing with some of these issues, and the chatbot they've had there, of course, found itself in hot water during the election cycle in terms of spreading false information. We know the end of CrowdTangle and what that meant for research, and we know that there was a bipartisan effort in Congress to try and mandate that there be more sharing of data, right, by researchers, civil society institutions, so that we can get a sense and scale and scope of the problem. And we know that right now there appears to be a little bit of concern over whether or not, both legacy companies, but also newer ones, think it's sort of worth their while, right, to sort of play a strong role in trying to ensure the information environment is not polluted, right, with regards to elections. Saying, when I hear, Meta's CEO going on Capitol Hill and claiming that the Biden administration, without evidence, put its thumb on the scale, that's right. That's a problem. Again, it's a little far field, but of course it matters when you think about, you compare sort of, Musk's behavior, and you think about, I guess not social media, it's traditional legacy media, but you think about obviously the Washington Post decision to withhold an op-ed in the manner it did, right? Clearly raises more questions. And so, no, I think there's certainly more that needs to be sort of looked at and done. And I think that's going to become even more important now as we look and see, I think, and I know some folks, I know you want to rest and it's important to take a deep breath and go for a walk, but, you may have seen, right, that, the person who's recently been put forward to chair the FCC is very much qualified for the position. also played, I think, a pretty strong hand in doing the FCC piece of, and Project 2025. And there's real implications there for social media companies. And so I think there's certainly, a lot more that needs to be done there.
Absolutely. So and we're kind of coming to the top of the hour. And so I want to kind of end a little bit on a positive note. And so as we look at the horizon of a healthy democracy and maintaining our right to vote in free and fair elections, what innovations are you most excited about? And if you could live in a world where everything that needed to be created in order to make magic happen exists, what would you like to see implemented in our elections that you would believe would transform this right for the American people?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, I think there are a few things that come to mind. I mean, one is I believe that part of the reason, it's worth noting that those who supported democracy, right, those of you who served as poll workers, those of you that voted, those of you that observed the process, played a critical role in helping uphold the 2024 election. I think, look, there was real pressure in Georgia to change processes shortly before the election, in Pennsylvania to change processes shortly before the election, in Arizona to ignore guidance from the Secretary of State around, how votes could sort of be cast. And even though there were, hiccups here, we saw, right, a real resilient America. And I think, notwithstanding perhaps the concerns some folks have, we continue to have a decentralized election process, and that has continued to open up opportunities for innovation. And it's not everywhere, but we continue to see innovation coming to the fore in a number of places, right? We've seen jurisdictions that have adopted, even in recent years, same-day registration and automatic voter registration. We, again, have more places adopting early voting. We have seen efforts to innovative ideas to staff sort of polling places and to try and again make sure that we're serving voters right correctly and promptly, sort of with disabilities. And we're seeing officials and voters right handle, and I think about sort of Hurricane Helene, right, handle the sort of the things that come out of nowhere and do it with, frankly, a great deal of sort of aplomb, considering whatever other thing, things like what you might want to deal with following a hurricane, right? Voting may not be the first thing on your list between, shelter, food, and all the rest of it. And so, I think some of that innovativeness and ingenuity is going to continue to be important. And I think we've seen, in many cases, closer collaboration between election officials and civil society groups on getting people out to vote, closer collaboration between law enforcement and election officials on being able to try and, counter harms. None of this is sort of perfect. It would be helpful to obviously have a better information environment. It would be helpful to obviously have federal actors right at the top who I think are, believing right in the importance of free and fair elections. But I do think, this latest election was the most recent to speak to sort of the ingenuity, right, of Americans to be able, when they participate, right, we can carry out imperfect but very, very legitimate, right, successful elections.
And I think that is the perfect endpoint. David, thank you so much for joining us here at the CES Multiverse and sharing your expertise. Thank you to everyone that joined in on the live stream and everyone that will review this after the fact. And we thank you for your work in this space, David. Just one last point. If people wanted to find you, help them track you down, where can they find you at?
Sure. They can feel free to, if they want, they obviously they go at David Allen Levine on X. I'm also on LinkedIn, and I know we can make sure to share on where that is. And in terms of, I know you alluded to it, obviously, I'm at, you can reach out dlevine4@gmu.edu, which is sort of the email for George Mason, where I teach election security.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody. Have a great one.
Thank you.